Hey guys, Pedro here to tell you about the latest from Phantom Elite Blue Blood, out March 17th on Frontiers Music. This album has 10 tracks, 43 minutes in length, and this is the band's third full-length studio album. They are an international symphonic metal band. From a design point of view, there's not much to say. This is not a record that builds itself on a journey. It doesn't build itself around the collective. It's not an album that needs a specific design, a specific flow, in order for the overall feel of the record to come across, in order for the identity of the record to be better understood by the listener. This album is all about the individual songs. It feels more like a compilation than anything else. Great individual tracks that obviously the way they put together offer a little bit of a roller coaster ride. It does offer a lot of ebbs and flows, a lot of ups and downs, but it really comes down to the quality of these 10 songs and not necessarily the quality that together they offer the collective. As far as the sound is concerned, this is a modern metal sounding record. And what I mean by that is an album that doesn't fall under one specific umbrella or under one specific genre, because it has a lot of influences in the sound, in the composition, in the overall approach. It's metal infused with pop, symphonic, progressive, metalcore, all the above. So when you have an album like this, you see the volatility from track to track. You see the different DNA of the band expressed across a multitude of tracks in very different ways. It's an album that's very rich sound-wise because of it. It's not about the depth of that sound, but rather how rich it is in terms of choices, in terms of palette across all 10 tracks. It's a record that has big sound most of the time. Almost every single song feels very epic, larger than life, if you will, but it also has the ability to bring that large sound experience and put it inside a box and presented it in a very simple format, which makes it easier to digest and it makes it easier to grasp, easier to understand. Oversimplifying, if you will, complex parameters and complex details of these songs allow for tracks to become more digestible. They become earworms a lot easier. They become radio friendly across all of its existence. And that's how this album comes across, and that's how this genre is really defining itself. A genre that lives heavily on the back of the symphonic elements, of the orchestrations, of the synths and keyboards. And this album is no different. I'm not going to say that they're driving the experience, but they're definitely one of the main protagonists of this entire soundscape. They create the ambiance that the songs have. At times they infuse a lot of the melody that the tracks have. A lot of the aromas of the songs, a lot of the richness of the songs derives from those compositions, derives from those orchestrations, from those symphonic elements that really push these tracks, and that becomes the defining factor, or at least the most defining factor of the sound from start to finish. You can still talk about the guitars on this album because obviously they play a role, but outside the synths and guitars, the album doesn't really have another element that surpasses expectations or that has a big fingerprint on the overall sound experience. The guitars on this album are interesting because they create the metal that the sound have. They give a little bit meat on the bone on some of these tracks. And some songs they feel quite heavy, but in the background creating a subtle heaviness to the sound to not take away from the overall very light experience that this album puts together, but they still have an impact. They also create a lot of the melodies that you're going to hear on this album. They create a lot of the ambiances and experience, ebbs and flows from song to song and within songs themselves. So they have a subtle but impactful role in the overall experience. It's just because the overall nature of this album is really the junction of all these moving pieces coming together, and it becomes a lot harder to define which element plays more of a role than the other. Because when you listen to this album, you're listening to the experience of the album. You're listening to how this album makes you feel. You're listening to how this soundscape, this soundtrack really sets itself for an incredible vocal performance by Marina. So because of that, it becomes less important on what drives it or what becomes the main protagonist of that sound, and rather about how all the parts can coexist with one another perfectly in order for Marina to have the perfect backdrop for her voice. And her voice is perhaps the red line, the breadcrumbs that connects all of these different songs, because her performance is outstanding regardless of the experience, regardless of the track, regardless of the influence. Not to say that she has a one-size-fits-all approach throughout, because she doesn't, and it would be impossible to have a record work in that format considering the volatility of the sound. But her consistent expression of her voice, of her range, her consistency in terms of how good she is, really allows you to feel like you are listening to Phantom Elite from beginning to end, regardless of how different these songs are. And she is phenomenal. She has an incredible range on full display. It feels like this was an album written specifically with her voice in mind, in order to enhance that experience, in order to enhance her instrument, and let her be the conductor of the sound. Let her dictate the drive that these songs have and the impact that they will have with the listeners. Overall, an album that has interesting sound, great production behind it, great mixing, really elevating all of these little details, bringing that modern touch to this metal record and giving her room to spread her wings. Because at the end of the day, most listeners will come to this record because of her and will stay with it because of her. At least that was the case with me. I enjoyed her performance thoroughly. Like every single song, I felt like she gave more than what was expected of her, and that made the songs memorable on its own. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with This Sick World. It brings in at the beginning a little bit of a hip-hop vibe to it, vocally. It brings in a little bit of a hip-hop vibe, and then it moves into a more modern metal sounding experience, a little bit more pop with synth driving sound behind it, creating this layered texture sound that always morphing, always moving, never staying still throughout the entire duration of the song. Now the vocals really pop on this track, and using some backing vocals as layers, it gives depth to the overall delivery, to the overall performance. It also creates subtle ebbs and flows, subtle ups and downs, because musically this track moves quite a bit. And then when you add those backing vocals, you're forcing the vocals as well to move quite a bit. So there's movement across all the parameters, which makes the song be volatile on one hand, but very balanced on the other. Now there's an acoustic bridge that drops into this more melancholic, melodic approach, and you don't really see it coming because the song has such an upbeat feel to it. But then is when the song goes a little bit south. It allows you to maybe reset a little bit and then get ready for how it closes off, and it starts to close off more with a bite, a lot more heaviness from guitars and drums, and then it starts to simmer down as you reach the end. A very similar start to a very similar finish. Next you have Apex. First of all, let me say, great bass underline on this track. I really enjoyed how much the bass pops. It's not every day that a band that's releasing an album like this with this more modern metal feel to it that allows the bass to be this predominant on a single track. Normally the bass is a little bit forgotten. I really enjoy the fact that it came across very well on this song. It allows also for the vocals to have more of a pop to them, not just a pop in terms of how they come across, but also a little bit more of a pop feel in the delivery, in the tonality of them. Now the song then turns a little bit heavier. There's a little bit more of a heavier sound to it, pushing a more vocal layered delivery that accompanies that sound perfectly well. Makes the chorus feel bigger as well. It's a song that has a big, impactful chorus, and that's always important in order for the song to be more memorable all around. But this is a track that morphs and grows from verse to verse. It feels like they're adding layers, they're adding texture with every single verse that comes across. The only thing that stays a little bit more balanced is the chorus. The chorus is where the consistency of the track lies, and the verses is where you see the evolution of the song itself. And that evolution sound-wise, and then the vocal approach overall, gives this track a little bit of a Gwen Stefani / Lady Gaga. Sometimes it feels like you're listening to No Doubt or even Gwen Stefani. Sometimes it feels like you're listening more to Lady Gaga. It's a very interesting song from those dynamics. It has a pop approach to it, but still some meat on the bone that gives some thickness, some heaviness, light heaviness to the overall experience. Last but not least, Daydark, a more metal sounding song all around. When I think of modern metal, when I think of bands these days that are symphonic but not overly symphonic, that include a lot of synths, a lot of orchestrations into their sound in order to create more a more melodic approach, not necessarily trying to push the songs into this epic stratosphere, but more a melodic approach. This style, this sound, this song is what I think of, and this track has all of those elements. It has guitars, it has drums, It has a little bit of power in them, but then it has the synths and the orchestrations that bring this melody that just infuses everything else around them. It is impossible to separate those two worlds. And then on top of it all, you have great vocals that stay consistent in their performance, not necessarily in their delivery, from start to end. So it's really a modern metal song in all senses of the word, musically, construction-wise, and vocally. This is it, Phantom Elite, Blue Blood, out March 17th on Frontiers Music. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.